Buenas noches. Hoy haré una serie de videos. No voy a tomarme mucho tiempo en la presentación. Esta noche a las 9 de la noche tengo una directa acerca del problema de Ucrania y de aquí a las 9 transmitiré varios videos que me sirvan como base para que las personas entiendan lo que voy a hablar. Porque cada una de las razones que voy a exponer contienen en sí mismo una historia. ¿Ya? Hoy comenzaré con la historia de lo ocurrido en Odessa el 2 de mayo de 2014. No necesariamente iré en orden cronológico, voy a empezar con el 2 de mayo, que es lo que he encontrado en español. Y pues ahí se lo voy a poner. Así que comparto pantalla, me retiro y nos quedamos mirando un video de 10 minutos, muy importante, muy importante. No ves este video, no entiendes qué está pasando en Ucrania.
On March 2nd, 2014, over 40 people were murdered in Odessa, Ukraine. Some eyewitnesses claim that the real number is over 100. Some of the victims were burned alive, others were strangled or beaten to death. A pregnant woman was among those killed. I'm not going to show the images of the dead bodies directly in this video because doing so would either get the video blocked or age restricted. In the description, you'll find a link to a page where you can view those images and videos if you're so inclined. I warn you, though, they are truly horrific and should not be viewed in front of children. Now, the mainstream media and Western politicians have glossed over what happened that day. They've attempted to blur the chain of events and have completely avoided condemning those responsible. Instead, they've blamed the anti-Kiev protesters and Russia for the violence. But what about that video that showed the anti-Kiev protesters firing automatic weapons during the clash? You're probably thinking about this video. This is the video that the corporate media outlets broadcasted to the public, which shows what appears to be anti-Kiev protesters firing on Maidan protesters on May 2nd. Open and shut case, right? These guys brought this on themselves. If you just saw this clip, that would be the obvious conclusion. However, this isn't the only clip that we have. We have quite a bit of footage that the mainstream media isn't showing you, and that footage tells a very, very different story. Here's that same scene with the shooter videotaped from a different angle. Now pay close attention to the people he's with. The red armbands these guys are wearing are supposed to symbolize the anti-Kiev contingent. In particular, pay attention to this man in the brown jacket. Also take note of this padding that he's carrying in his right hand. This guy with the brown jacket is important, and you'll see why when we show you the next clip. This next clip I'm going to show you first at normal speed, then we're going to slow it down and freeze frames to point out important details.
Пострадал начальник милиции общественной безопасности Фучиджи. У него ранение в руку. Полковник Фучиджи с окровавленной рукой, ему оказывается помощь на месте.
Now, if we freeze this frame, the man in the back of the ambulance that invites the police officer to get in looks an awful lot like the shooter. But this is a very brief scene and the image isn't clear enough to hang a case on it. However, what we see next is very clear. Remember the man with the brown suit and the odd padding that was in the contingent that was firing on the protesters? Here he is again, helping a police officer get into that ambulance, carrying that masked man. Notice the men with red armbands with him. It turns out we have lots of images and footage tying the police to this provocation. The officer being escorted to the ambulance was photographed and videotaped from multiple angles. Witnesses have identified him as Colonel Fusheji. Here we see him and other police consulting with masked men who are presenting themselves as anti-Kiev protesters. Here we have an unidentified officer giving instructions to a group of these masked men. Why would the Ukrainian provisional government work with thugs presenting themselves as the opposition? Why would they stand by and allow these thugs to escalate the situation by firing into the crowd and then flee the scene with them? Doesn't that strike you as a little bit odd? This is a very old tactic. The technical term, which has been in use since the 1870s, is agent provocateur. That's French for provoking agent. Authorities use agent provocateurs when they want to manufacture a justification for a crackdown against their opponents. And boy, did they capitalize on that justification in Odessa. The Maidan protesters, which eyewitnesses say outnumbered the anti-Kiev protesters 10-1, headed straight for the opposition's campground. First, they burned down their tents. The anti-Kiev protesters tried to put up a defense at the door, but the Maidan crowd began throwing Molotov cocktails. Soon the building was engulfed in flames, but the Maidan people didn't stop. Here's what the scene looked like on the ground. You can hear the crowd cheering as they set the building ablaze. In the full version of the video, the Maidan can be seen beating those who try to escape. Here you can see a Maidan activist shooting at those trying to escape from the windows. There was a fire station less than a kilometer away, but they didn't intervene for hours. Why? Here's why. The Maidan crowd blockaded the fire truck and wouldn't let the firefighters operate. It's not unclear how the fire started, as the mainstream media has been trying to convince you, nor is it unclear who started the fire. Here we see a group of Maidan girls doing their part by filling up Molotov cocktails behind the scenes while the boys are busy using them to burn people alive. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was murder. One of the official YouTube channels for the Maidan, Euromaidan PR, uploaded this video right after the blaze where they do a walkthrough of the building examining the corpses. They entitled it "Russian Terrorists Burned Alive in the Trade Union Building Fire in Odessa, Ukraine, May 2nd, 2014. They were proud of what they did, and they weren't the only ones. Following is a screenshot I took from a public post on Facebook made by the Ukrainian nationalist Irina Faryon, who publicly commended the murderers. All over the internet, self-proclaimed fascists were hailing this as a victory for the extreme right. A victory over who? There were no Russian citizens among the dead. They were all Ukrainians. I'm not going to show you the video that they uploaded. It's far too graphic. Again, you'll find a link in the description to watch it if you're so inclined. As horrific as the video is, it's a bit deceptive because it doesn't show the pregnant woman who was killed upstairs. Her body wasn't burned at all. She appeared to have been strangled to death. What's even more disturbing is that there was video taken from the ground which captured the audio of her screaming in her final moments. After the screaming stopped, Maidan activists presented themselves at the window, gleefully waving the Ukrainian flag. During all of this, the police were standing by and did nothing. There was no investigation. In fact, the provisional government in Kiev has blamed the anti-Kiev protesters for the fire and arrested the survivors. Apparently, these people burned themselves to death and strangled their own people. Right. Does this all seem out of place with the narrative you've been handed for months by the media and the politicians? You believed them when they told you that the accusations that the Maidan was run by neo-Nazis were just baseless conspiracy theories, even though the BBC was reporting on their rise back in 2012. In that first report, they specifically placed attention on a group called Svoboda, led by a man named Oli Tyanibok. In that article, they referred to Svoboda as a proto-fascist organization, and they covered Tyanibok's long history of targeting Jews and ethnic Russians. They pointed out that in 2004, he was kicked out of Viktor Yushchenko's government for making a speech calling for Ukrainians to fight against a, quote, Muscovite Jewish mafia. And in 2005, he signed his name to an open letter to the leadership of Ukraine entitled Stop the Criminal Activities of Organized Jewry. Here's that same Oli Tyanibok rubbing shoulders with John McCain, and here with U.S. State Department diplomat Victoria Nuland. That's the same Victoria Nuland that was caught in a leaked phone call talking about installing Arseniy Yatsenyuk to run the provisional government. And Tyanibok is just one of several known neo-Nazis currently holding high office in Kiev. For example, Dmitry Yarosh, a prominent right sector leader who was installed as Ukraine's Deputy Secretary of National Security. But don't take my word for it. Go read what the BBC said about these people back in 2012. Go look at this article from Reuters, which acknowledges that these guys are well positioned in the current government. Then, if you've got the guts, go look at the photos from the crime scene in Odessa. If you do, you'll understand that what we're dealing with here isn't just a few politicians with offensive opinions. These guys are the real deal. These are neo-Nazi fascists who are willing to murder anyone who gets in their way. The US and the EU are backing them, and the corporate media is covering up their crimes. But why would these guys resort to the kind of brutality we saw in Odessa? It wasn't very smart. The images in the video of the crime scene have gone viral. That's a public relations disaster that will have lasting consequences. Why would they do something like this? Because they're running out of options. There's a rebellion spreading all across Ukraine. And in spite of what the corporate media has been trying to sell you, these aren't pro-Russian protesters. The people don't trust the coup-appointed government, and they don't want to live under its rule. What they're asking for is a federal system comprised of states with a certain degree of autonomy, kind of like what the United States used to be. Kiev has ordered the military to put down the rebellion 3 times already, but only a fraction of the Ukrainian military has been willing to fire on its own people. Not only have the troops refused to fight, but many have switched sides and are now fighting for the resistance. Others are on the fence, contemplating turning their guns on Kiev and saying so publicly.
Mr. Yatsenyuk and company. Еще там company. Большое вам спасибо за зарплату 1200 гривен за 2 месяца. Поверьте мне стыдно. Вы меня слышите? Задумайтесь, потому что мы можем повернуть колонну на вас.
That's a serious problem for the provisional government, especially since the IMF made it very clear that the $17 billion loan package that they're offering will be canceled if Kiev fails to regain control of the east. It's worth noting that Kiev began the third military offensive right after the IMF made that threat. And right after the massacre in Odessa, the IMF made the first $3.2 billion payment towards that $17 billion. Guess they earned it. The grand irony here is that these so-called nationalists are apparently too stupid to realize that their leadership has just sold them out. You say you want a Ukraine for Ukrainians, but Kiev just brought in the IMF vultures. The IMF, this is the world's most notorious predatory lender. The Western globalists own you guys now. Debt is a far more insidious method of subjugation than military occupation. At least with an army, you can recognize the enemy and you can fight them. But when that enemy hides behind banks, they destroy a nation from the inside out. They use your own strength against you. Rather than fighting back, you'll end up groveling at their feet for table scraps. The West doesn't care about Ukraine. They're certainly not concerned about the welfare of their people. Ukraine is just a pawn. It's just a pivot point on the board. The real target is Russia. At this point, they're not even hiding it. If you pay attention, you'll notice the politicians and the media are doing everything in their power to turn the public against Russia. They're working hard to make you hate them and fear them. They're trying to create a boogeyman in your mind, kind of like how they did in the Cold War. Little details like the facts aren't an obstacle anymore. They're just making stuff up at this point, claiming to have evidence of Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, but never correcting themselves after the evidence was debunked. Claiming that the rebels in the east were ordering Jews to register and pay a special tax, never correcting themselves after a Jewish organization with connections to the region came forward to debunk the claim. And of course, predictably, they blamed the violence in Odessa on the Russians too. And they're not going to correct themselves. You've heard the saying, history is written by the winners. That's not poetic. That's a literal truth. Don't let these people win.